Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Iszi Lawrence. On this week's episode, I'm in Dave's house and we discuss where the idea that birds were dinosaurs came from, plus Suzy Buttress on our fine feathered friends, and Dave Hone forgets the name of a dinosaur.
I am in Dave's habitat, his natural habitat. It's slightly echoey, but it's a different type of atmosphere. There is an old banana. There is some Pepsi Max.
Banana is not that old.
Well, it's not a young banana, is it? It's not green. It's spotty. Yeah. That is an old banana. It's not rotting.
Yes.
And it's also a banana. I'm not big.
Of all the things in this.
I know,
I wouldn't think to describe the banana first.
That's what I was looking at. I was making sure the recording was working, and I saw there are skulls.
Yes, antelope, crocodile, lots of plants.
There are antelope and crocodile skulls. There aren't plant skulls, because that's like, what? No. Walnut shells. Anyway, shut up. We're not talking about any of that. We are going to talk about why it took until this podcast, really, for anybody to know that birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah, we never mentioned it before.
It really does annoy me, the fact that I was lied to at school. That most of the people that I meet don't believe me when I tell them that birds are dinosaurs, and look at me strangely when I get angry about it. Why don't we know about this more? You bad paleontologist, bad.
Yes, it's my fault.
It is your fault personally for not doing this podcast earlier with me and letting me know. And then why? But seriously, why?
I think a large part of it is the history of it. I mean, we've definitely talked before, I think in series 1, about the fact that birds are dinosaurs and all these feathered dinosaurs that have come out of China in particular, but now other places, including Germany and even Canada and Brazil. And these various features that you can see through all these different lineages that go through into birds. But an awful lot of that is very, very recent. And although it kind of restarted in what we call the dinosaur renaissance, and I think we've definitely talked about that before, part of the dinosaur renaissance is the fact that actually tying birds to dinosaurs. And that's a paleontologist called John Ostrom, who died only a few years ago. And he discovered Deinonychus, this famous dromaeosaur.
That looks like Velociraptor in people's heads.
Yeah, basically, but quite a bit bigger. So therefore, more like the movie one, and spotted a bunch of these bird-like features in it and realised that there was potentially this really quite strong tie between birds and dinosaurs. And that, I wouldn't say kick-started, but definitely was part of that renewed interest in dinosaurs and changing our understanding of them, because now we had a better framework for understanding them and their evolutionary history and yada, 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 and what they were capable of. But as with so many things in science, that's not a new idea at all. That was mid to late 70s, early 80s. And then obviously it firmed up massively in end of 80s, early 90s when these feathered dinosaurs started showing up. And that was pretty much a nail in the coffin, that definitely heading that way already. But now you've got other feathered dromaeosaurs and other feathered dinosaurs. Okay, feathers were clearly there. We only see feathers in birds. We've got over that gap between dinosaurs and Archaeopteryx in particular. But yeah, Archaeopteryx was found, or at least the first good skeleton.
Late 19th century. Mid-19th century.
Yeah, 2 or 3 years, or if not a few months after Darwin first published The Origin of Species, there's a great letter that he writes to one of his friends saying that, Archaeopteryx is this incredible discovery, because one of the big criticisms Darwin had from Origin of Species was that if everything's basically related to everything else, where are all the intermediates? Which is still a canard that the creationists bring up. It's like,
God of the gaps.
Yeah, you can't show that these things are connected. And birds were a huge gap, feathers, didn't know teeth, could fly, didn't really look like anything else. And then, lo and behold, here's a skeleton with teeth and clawed hands and a big bony tail and no big sternum and no reverse toe, and yet covered in very obvious flight feathers. And it's kind of like, there you go. I don't know what it is, but it's sure as hell an intermediate of something on the way to birds. And he writes something like it's the most marvellous confirmation. And so, yeah, Archaeopteryx is floating around, for want of a better phrase, and it's out there, but quite what it was obviously had these reptile features, but that's not the same thing as it had dinosaur features. because we didn't have any small dinosaurs. Were things like Allosaurus and Triceratops. Well, we didn't have Triceratops at this point either. I mean, this is the earliest days of dinosaurs.
We had Iguanodons.
We've got we've got Iguanodon and Megalosaurus. Well, right, it was Richard Owen who described the first Archaeopteryx, who was effectively by modern standards, creationist of some description. He sure as hell wasn't an evolutionist because he didn't like Darwin or Darwin's theories very much. It was describing things like Megalosaurus, and again, remember just how incomplete they were. It's not like we had little things like Velociraptor, let alone even smaller. Now, Archaeopteryx is the size of a crow. It's a bird size. We just don't have, dinosaurs are the giant things. And even then, evolution was kind of thought of in terms of a certain amount of succession, age of reptiles. Well, here's a birdie thing floating around. Presumably it's something kind of separate, something kind of different. And even if you go through into, late 1800s, early 1900s, yes, we've got loads more dinosaurs now. We do have Diplodocus and Triceratops and T-Rex. It's like we're not seeing lots of little birdie things.
No, that's just because of the types of deposits that they're looking in, isn't it?
At least in part, yeah. And also people were probably pulling out these bits and not realising what they were. There were whole books written about these giant birds. There were books about the giant birds of North America. And of course, we now know that they're theropod footprints. What they'd found was theropod footprints, but theropods hadn't been discovered. So you got these big 3-toed tracks and occasionally a little 4th toe at the back running around. Well, that's the footprints birds leave.
Yeah.
So there must have been these giant birds. We just haven't found the skeletons yet. And of course, they kind of never did because they were allosaurs and things like that. Or even the small ones were coelophysids. We didn't know, hadn't found them. And yeah, the first time we really got a small dinosaur, and I'll add a slight caveat, that we knew was a small dinosaur, because as usual, hindsight has revealed a few that we did have but didn't realise what they were. Yeah, was Compsognathus from basically the same deposits. So the famous Solnhofen of Bavaria, where hundreds of pterosaurs, lots and lots and lots of fish and crocodiles and various other things, and very occasionally an Archaeopteryx, and very occasionally a couple of other small dinosaurs. But we got Compsognathus, and Compsognathus is about the same size as Archaeopteryx.
Describe Compsognathus for our listeners.
It would be almost a classic theropod, just very, very small. It's got a medium-sized head. The head's not particularly big or particularly small, and the neck's not particularly long or particularly short. The arms aren't particularly long or short. If you cranked a Megalosaurus or an Allosaurus down quite a lot until it was only 60 centimetres long... Aww. That's kind of what Compsognathus is. We now know they're very close related to tyrannosaurs, but obviously early tyrannosaurs, again, are pretty generic as theropods go. They don't have the big head, they don't have the small arms.
So we're talking more like early Cretaceous sort of time? Or
late Jurassic.
Wow, really? Yeah, cool.
So same age as Archaeopteryx. And Compsognathus, it's a similar size. That helps enormously. You've got rid of that size problem almost immediately. The skeleton's rather broken up in some ways. It's one of those annoying ones where it's nearly complete. You've got almost all the bones, but the skull's disarticulated and some of them rotated and some of them a bit squished. It's a bit broken up. Some bits aren't very well preserved. I've seen it, and it's one of those ones where the more you look at it, the less good it is. Like, you get your first glance, go, oh, wow, it's almost a whole skeleton. Oh, I can't quite see. Oh, and that's broken. And I want to see, and that's not preserved. Oh, and those every detail you try and find,
it's enough to go, quite that's dinosaur. Let me learn about it. I can't.
Yeah, I mean, obviously much better than that, but equally not anything like as good as you think it is when you first look at it. But yeah, Thomas Henry Huxley, famous Darwinian supporter and famous anti-Richard Owen.
He was Darwin's bulldog,
yes, that was his nickname, and was, I want to say father or grandfather, I think grandfather of Aldous Huxley, who was also the brother of, and now I've forgotten his name, the other Huxley, who was also a biologist. So one grandson went into biology and the other became the author. Wow. I believe they were both present at the unveiling of Huxley's statue at the Natural History Museum, and one of them threw up in the other one's hat. I remember reading
important
this.
Facts there.
Yes. But anyway, Huxley, so big Darwin supporter, great anatomist, big supporter of evolution. He had a look at Compsognathus and realised that it had really quite a lot in common with Archaeopteryx, and made a very early suggestion, I want to say 1905-ish kind of time, that maybe birds and dinosaurs are connected through these two. And he also pointed out that obviously a bunch of things that are present in Compsognathus are present in much bigger theropods. He says, look, this feature is in Allosaurus and Compsognathus and Archaeopteryx. But you can see the reticence for people looking at an Allosaurus and Archaeopteryx and putting them together. But once you've got over that size barrier with that much, much smaller animal, it's easier to sell.
And then even looking at Archaeopteryx and then going blue tip. That's
it's
different creatures.
But still a lot easier. So again, the dinosaur renaissance idea that birds are dinosaurs, it's got a very, very long antecedent. And people were discussing various things. There's this famous drawing by a guy called, or explanation that came with the drawing by William Beebe, of a four-winged dinosaur. He proposed the ancestor of birds being these four-winged animals that glided off, basically wings on its arms and wings on its legs. And of course, we then went and found Microraptor in the late 90s, which exactly has that plan form. So,
does Microraptor have quill knobs on its legs then?
No, but the flight feathers are preserved. You can see asymmetrical long flight feathers on their legs.
Wow.
They're there.
Do any modern birds have flight feathers on their legs?
Not in quite the same way, but if you've ever seen videos of big eagles, when they come in and drop their legs, there are some much bigger feathers on their legs. I think people realise they have quite a
good trouser.
Expansion, basically, with some structure to them. There's some good discussion going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s about this kind of stuff. Some really serious proposals. But what really killed it was a guy called Heilmann. I want to say he's called Gerhardt, but I can't remember if that's his first name or not. But Heilmann, who wrote a book on the origin of birds. And I'm paraphrasing badly and enormously, but he basically wrote this book going, good God, birds have an awful lot in common with dinosaurs. It's really quite notable just how similar they are. But they don't have a furcula, so they can't be, so they're probably another kind of reptile at the end.
They don't have a what?
A furcula.
What is a furcula, Dave?
Well, we have discussed this on more than one occasion, and you dug it out of a turkey. It's the wishbone. Fused clavicles.
It's your collarbone that's all flexy on birds.
Yeah, but we have two separate ones, one each side. They fuse them together in the middle. And at the time, so there's two important things. At the time, we didn't know for one of Archaeopteryx. We've now found it in subsequent Archaeopteryx specimens. We also didn't know it in any dinosaurs. We now have furculae, being the correct plural, in all kinds. We've got them for T-Rex.
You've got one in this flat.
I've got a cast of one. Not anymore, to get back to the office the other day. But we've got them for things like T-Rex. We've absolutely got them for a bunch of dromaeosaurs. But we've even got them in some of the early sauropodomorphs.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just the theropods. They do turn up in other branches of dinosaur evolution. So we didn't have them.
Why would a sauropodomorph need to flap?
Well, it's more that it's just generally part of the shoulder structure. We don't flap them, we've got them.
Yeah, but they're not connected and they're...
Right, but they're in a different form. They
also can flap.
Yeah, but they're not the very derived bird one. You think, if they'd appeared, that would have... If we'd found them earlier, that might have got over that problem and we might have solved this sooner. But the other reason was a thing called Dollo's law. Dollo, Louis Dollo, and he basically had it was one of those classic good old bit of sciences where a scientist notices a general pattern and creates a law, and everyone goes, yes, that's true, rather than actually checking if it's true, or if you find an exception, go, oh, maybe it isn't. And
that's the exception that proves the rule.
Well, yeah, kind of, right. And Dollo's law was the idea that once something in evolution had been lost, it could never be regained. Now, we know that's not true because we absolutely know about things which have been lost and been regained. For example, lizards have lost legs multiple times. There's this whole group of skinks, I want to say Caribbean, but could be South American, have been shown that they gain and lose front and back legs depending on quite what they're doing in different islands at different times. You've got lineages that have got rid of them and then brought them back, and numbers of toes and things like this.
You can get chickens to regrow teeth if you interbreed them enough,
Yeah, basically because we now understand genetics that things can get buried and then be uncovered, or even just be evolve again from scratch if the selection pressures really are good enough, at least in theory. But everyone bought Dollo's law, and it's like, well, birds have a clavicle and dinosaurs don't, so how could birds have evolved from dinosaurs? Birds have the furcula and dinosaurs didn't. That would mean they had to have re-evolved a lost structure. And since you can't re-evolve a lost structure, birds can't be dinosaurs.
So that means that they assume that the ancestors of dinosaurs had it.
Though they do, it's normal in reptiles.
Ah.
So that's the thing. They go, well, reptiles have got it, dinosaurs have lost it, birds have got it. They couldn't have inherited it from dinosaurs because once it's lost, it can never come back. Therefore, birds must be some other kind of reptile. And of course, it was spurious thinking off a dodgy non-law that turned out to be wrong.
They still knew that birds were related to reptiles, though, which still upsets me because I didn't.
Yeah, but it meant that there was this idea that obviously you can see those similarities. And so birds clearly are reptiles of some description, but not dinosaurs. And everyone basically got stuck on this incorrect point. And then, of course, remember that once you get into the early 1900s, it's not that dinosaurs are passé, but it's very much about digging up the new biggest thing. No one's studying them intensely. You've got to remember in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a handful of paleontologists working on dinosaurs. It is not the situation today. We've got hundreds of people working on this stuff. Of course, it kind of got abandoned. And that's really what led to this giant doldrums where nothing really happened and birds were some kind of random reptile and couldn't be dinosaurs. So we ended up with this big hole, and it was only, again, the Renaissance and finding things that were very dinosaur-like, finding dinosaurs that were very bird-like and recognising that Dollo's law really shouldn't be a law, that kind of hump got over and the idea that birds were dinosaurs returned.
But it was in the 1970s and 80s, so why wasn't... They didn't really make, Jurassic Park... I know we could always go back to Jurassic Park, but they could have made it more bird.
They could have, but I think it's the thing of, bringing it to the public's attention. There's the scene in the book where Arnold, the genetic engineer, basically says he wants to kill all the dinosaurs and regrow them to look like what people think dinosaurs are, because they're not slow, fat, tail-dragging reptiles. They're running around being really quick and scary. And he goes, the public don't want to see that. They want to pay to see what they think they're going to see. And they'll think we've done it wrong if they don't look like what they think.
That's exactly what the filmmakers thought, as well as the dinosaurs that bring back should be like that.
Remember, in many ways, Jurassic Park did drag the public's view of dinosaurs kicking and screaming into the 21st century, at least the late 20th century, because T-Rex's tail isn't dragging on the ground. It's running. They say velociraptors are clever and they can run as fast as a cheetah. That was really changing people's perceptions of them, even if it didn't go as far as we would have liked with things like feathers and other stuff. It's take the rough with the smooth. It did a hell of a lot of good, even if it did some things that could have been better. But the other thing, which is just about still lingering, is band.
Band?
B-A-N-D, which is...
I know how to spell band.
Yes. This is it could be B-A-N-N-E-D.
I suppose. I know about that too.
It's an acronym for Birds Are Not Dinosaurs.
Right.
And there was a group of prominent biologists, and I say biologists, there were some paleontologists, but in particular several ornithologists, so studies of modern birds.
Not ornithischian dinosaurs.
No. Who were very unhappy with basically unhappy with the idea that their precious birds be sullied by being dinosaurs and basically lumped in with them. And one prominent proponent, a guy called Alan Fiducia, is still writing books, like he's got one out in the last couple of months, arguing that birds aren't dinosaurs.
But
despite the overwhelming evidence, and despite the fact that he's contradicted himself multiple times on numerous fronts about quite what he thinks in order to get his arguments to square with the argument that he's trying to have at this point pretty much with himself.
Any good points? I mean, is there one that like makes you go, oh, that's a nice idea, but
not really. I mean, there was lots of, as you said, God of the gaps arguments. It's like, oh, you haven't solved this problem. Yes, but we've solved all these others. Oh, yes, but this could all be convergent evolution. It's like, well, it could, but it's extremely unlikely. I mean, an example of the kind of mental hoops he was jumping through is that for a long time, he and his allies were saying, things like Deinonychus, Microraptor, all these feathered dinosaurs were not the antecedents of birds. They had nothing to do with birds. They'd acquired these bird-like features, including early feathers, entirely independently. Okay. And then later on, he went, no, they're all early flightless birds. They're not dinosaurs. And it's like, you can't have it both ways. So you used to say that they were dinosaurs but not birds, and now you say they're birds that not dinosaurs. It's almost like birds and dinosaurs are so similar that you can't tell them apart and decide which side of that line to draw. Yeah. And of course, there were lots of, in addition to ignoring all those anatomical similarities and and stuff like this, like feathers, it's not, in theory, impossible that feathers evolved twice independently. But it seems very unlikely that it did it alongside hollow bones and that special wrist structure that we've talked about and all these other things. But, you get into these big gap problems. Okay, let's say Archaeopteryx is a true bird and has nothing to do with dinosaur evolution and evolved. The big argument was it was a group of thecodonts. Ooh. So thecodonts means socket tooth. Mm-hmm. So this is one branch of reptiles. Crocodiles are thecodonts because they have sockets for their teeth. So do dinosaurs, and so does Archaeopteryx. One of the things that would tie it to them. So they're like, it's a separate branch of thecodont evolution. So go back to before crocodiles. One of those, and there were some weird, odd little reptiles in the thecodonts, to be fair. One of those has gone on to produce birds. Okay, but we've been digging for 150 years since Archaeopteryx came out. Where are these birdy thecodont things all the way from the middle Triassic to the late Jurassic? And we've never found one anywhere at any point.
Could you just accidentally misconstrued one to be a dinosaur and actually?
Well, so there are some small theropods and theropod-like things from the Triassic, which were at one point called birds, and that was a big case. It's like, well, here we go. Is our Triassic birds? And it's like, but the theropods, or they're not even that. Very broken, poorly preserved. There's a thing called Proto-Avis, early bird. Proto-Avis is a melange of stuff, and it's probably more than one species mixed up, and it's not obviously a bird any more than it's an early pneumatic theropod. Kind of what you'd expect from the Triassic. Basically, the short answer is no. There was no really good evidence for this. But Fiducci was an extremely prominent ornithological researcher. He's written brilliant books about bird evolution to get past dinosaurs. You get past that minor detail. I've got a bunch of his books. They're superb. You want to know about the evolutionary history of birds and their biology and ecology? Fantastic. But
not so good after 65.
Well, right, but remember that, again, science has had this giant bloom. It's not just paleontology since the 70s and 80s. He was an absolute world authority. The bird research community were not looking at dinosaurs. He was one of the few people who straddled that bridge into paleontology and modern species. And he was writing dozens of books and papers arguing this. And those guys weren't reading the dinosaur literature, and basically the whole field went with him. There's a paper, I want to say, even from something like 2010 or 2012, done, I think there were two authors on the paper, but particularly a guy called Richard Prum, who's a prominent evolutionary biologist. And it was literally written as an appeal to the ornithological community. Guys, you're 40 years out of date. Birds are dinosaurs, and you need to start using that to understand the evolutionary history of your research group. The debate was never much of one, and Fiducci and his colleagues completely wrong. Ditch it. Birds are dinosaurs and start listening to us. And the fact that they're writing that only 10 years ago.
In terms of the public opinion, because I went to the Cheltenham Science Festival and I explained this to the people, and they were like, well, that's really nonsense. And I went, and I've been telling people in pubs, because that is the nature of my comedy prowess, is to shout about ornithischians not being related to birds and other dinosaurs are birds. The general consensus is, well, you've got that wrong. And I haven't.
Yeah.
I really haven't. I haven't got it wrong, Dave, have I?
Yeah. No, but again, that's the general public. We're talking about scientists who work on that in that field.
But I think it's important that people know what they're feeding on their bird feeders.
Yeah,
it's not birds. Well, it
is.
Birds.
Let's get that right.
I mean, we should call them, dinosaurs and get rid of this bird name.
Yeah, I mean,
cool.
I wrote an article in The Guardian years ago and called it "The Dinosaur on Your Bird Table."
Yeah,
and I think it was news to an awful lot of people.
And even now, people go, "Oh no, I know that birds are dinosaurs because they're descended from dinosaurs." And that, well, yeah, but they're also there at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the classic. If we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? It's like because things just don't replace other things. It's branching history, and we're not competing with monkeys, so we haven't driven them extinct. We're not climbing up trees and eating fruit and licking sap, so there's eco space for both.
I mean,
what you do in your weekends is
it's been amazing. There are no trees big enough for Dave to climb in his house. So I tell you who it is. I know an expert in birds. And that is Suzy Buttress. She lives down in Basingstoke, and we are friends. So, so Suzy Buttress is a podcast of The Casual Birder. She award-winning podcast, and she knows all about birds. But I bet you and I can surprise her if she comes on and asks us a question.
What I really want to know, Suzy, if we just start, what I want to know from you, Suzy, is did you know this fact that birds are dinosaurs? Did you know that already? When did you find this out, and why did they lie to us?
I found out this morning when I listened to your episode. All about
cutting it fine. But
well, no, absolutely. I did know that birds were the sort of living relatives of dinosaurs, but I didn't know that they were actually dinosaurs. And I was a little bit sceptical, I have to say, after hearing it on your show. I trusted it, but I thought, surely there's a step missing somewhere.
Because you have a dinosaur podcast. That's what you found out.
Yes.
You've got a dinosaur podcast.
And I had no...
And you never knew.
No. So I'm very delighted about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can hear a cat. I didn't know whose cat it was.
Yes.
It's yours.
It's not mine.
Fine. I'll edit him out.
Yes, so I found out very recently that birds are dinosaurs, and it's blown my mind a little bit.
It's weird, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's making me think about them in a different way. I've been looking at them very carefully today in my garden.
You've only got to look a pigeon in the eye and you can see the real evil there that 200 million years has produced.
I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to the idea that dinosaurs and birds are evil. Although there is a jackdaw on my deck at the moment looking for some mealworms.
Well, they are a bit evil.
Yeah,
they're very cool.
No, I do like
jackdaws.
jackdaws,
They're nice, great silver eyes, haven't they got?
Yeah,
silver eyes?
yeah, pale, yeah.
Yeah.
But only
Spooky
once they get to
looking.
adults. The youngsters have got sort of brownish black eyes, and I think they change as they get older. But they're very handsome looking birds. And people, because don't people start off with...
You can start quite pale and darken up, yeah.
Yeah. But no, really beautiful birds. Sorry, I will go off on flights of fancy with my birds.
You don't need to worry about that, though. That is fine. So, now that you know that birds are dinosaurs, you can basically use this to ask any bird question to Dave. Mainly, this whole conversation is basically going to be you two nerding out and me just going, tweet.
I think that's a little unfair, Izzy, because I happen to know that you're quite keen on birds and you're often asking birding questions. So
I'm a bit nerdy.
And, knowing that you're very keen on dinosaurs as well, I think you'll be a very equal part to this conversation.
Do you have a question you would like to ask Dave? Suzy?
I've actually got a couple. Okay. Well, the first one is that recently, so this might be a non-starter, which is why I've got the two. But recently, I've become very interested in birds' eyes, in the look of them. So not necessarily the function, although that probably is part of it. But in what made me really notice it was I've had some close interactions with a robin recently, a European robin.
Of course you have.
And for the first time ever, unfortunately, that robin disappeared after a week, and I've not seen it since. So I fear the worst because it had built up a relationship. But because they have very their eyes, it's very hard to see any iris in the eyes.
They're very black.
Sort of, yeah, and I know that they're active in very low light levels. So I figured it was that. But what did it for me was I've recently learned about stock doves, which is a type of pigeon. And I have wood pigeons in my garden all the time, and they've got quite distinctive eyes. And they've got, if you look at them closely, they're a little bit strange because they have the pupil kind of...
It's not in the centre.
Almost looks like it drips down into... Yeah, it drips down into the iris. So, you know, I kind of accept, yes, that's what wood pigeons look like, but I don't like looking at it too closely because it's a bit odd. But then I saw a stock dove recently, and it was... Because it's one of the first times I've ever seen a stock dove, I was looking at it quite closely, and I noticed that its eyes were much more like a robin's in that I couldn't see a coloured iris. And it made me start to look back through photographs that I've taken recently of the various birds that I've seen. And I hadn't really fully appreciated before how much variety there was in the iris colour. So some of the birds have got different coloured rims around the eyes, but actually a different colour iris. And then I was wondering also how many birds have this kind of non-circular pupil as well. And what would be the reason for that?
I'm not sure we actually know that much about it in birds, and therefore by extension, because obviously this is a dinosaur question, what that means for dinosaurs. Certainly pupil shape does vary quite heavily. Honestly, as just myself, I don't know how much it varies in birds. I don't think in the grand scheme of things it does vary very much in birds. But if you look, for example, at things like goats with their very laterally slotted, minus sign pupil, I should say. And then if you look at, there are some mongooses and things that have a very vertical one. And of course, crocodiles and a lot of lizards with that very vertical slit eye, as well as circular, are your kind of three standard ones. But also there's a bunch of geckos, and I think frogs too, that end up having, a slit.
One's like an octopus.
Well, more like they've got, octopus have a kind of W shape.
They've got holes,
but yeah, they have like a chain of beads. So they have a vertical slit, but then it has like spots on it as well. And different shapes do different things in terms of what they allow light in and what they're good for. There was a paper a few years ago that basically said either very tall animals or animals that operated in broad daylight tended to have circular pupils. And of course, that's true of the vast majority of birds operating in broad daylight. There's not many really nocturnal birds. And those tend to have circular pupils. So that would immediately put most birds into that category. Very small animals, and by extension those that I think are close to the ground, which of course can be true of a lot of ground birds, but they're still flying, still bright light. Again, there's trade-offs. Tend to have a kind of vertical slit pupil, and of course therefore that tend to true of lots of lizards and snakes and things like this. And then big herbivores tend to have this kind of horizontal pupil. So there's potential trade-offs there, at least for the dinosaurs, even if I think the birds will probably cluster mostly into the circular pupils. And off the top of my head, I can't think of any birds that don't have a circular pupil, though I bet they're out there because there's 10,500 or so thousand species of birds. I don't know all of them. There's going to be a few. I can see it.
So is the different coloured eyes presumably sexual selection?
Well, that's the other thing. Is again, I'm not sure we know. So the one bird which I'm familiar with in that sense, at least, is there's a thing called the saddlebill stork from sub-Saharan Africa, which is an absolutely beautiful bird. It's just about my favourite large bird. Black and white with this beautiful red and yellow beak. And as with a lot of big birds and hawks and sterns, I was going to say storks and herons and things like that, they all basically look identical. But in the saddlebill, the iris colour will tell you the sex. I can't remember which way round it is, but one has a red pupil and one has a yellow. And you usually see them in pairs. And if you get a photo of the two, and I've got a few that are taken in South Africa, and you get both of them in shot, you can see the different pupil colours. Now, I know they are sexually dimorphic. I don't know that it's actually that even the birds use that to recognise male versus female. I don't think anyone's tested it. As inevitably happens with so much of biology, I think this is something that confounds my students a huge amount. The example I always give is, look at the human medical literature. We have been studying humans very, very intensely for as long as there has been science. There are more researchers in single cancer institutes in the UK than there are biologists. And yet, we haven't really run out of things to say about humans yet. So the idea that we've worked out every bit of biology of every species, or even major bits of biology for very important groups, when you put it in that context, it shouldn't be a big surprise that actually, okay, I don't know and science doesn't know are clearly not synonymous, but I don't remember ever having come across anything about iris colour in birds beyond, a few vague things like, well, it's probably display in some, it's probably important for avoiding UV damage in some. It might just be neutral, as in there's no selective pressure. The colour could be whatever the hell it wants to be in some. That's about the limit.
One thing that I do know that birds and dinosaurs have, and also marine reptiles have, is the bones in the iris. Is that right?
Yeah, well, not in the iris, but they sit on the eye, the sclerotic ring.
Do you know about the sclerotic ring, Suzy?
I think so, but I didn't know that they were bones.
Yeah, it's weird.
You rarely... They're very rarely preserved in fossils because they're extremely, paper thin.
I tried to, when I was cutting up the turkey, because I was dissecting a dinosaur for Christmas, and I tried to cut up the eye and I couldn't.
Oh, you had the head as well?
Of course I had the head as well, because I had to have the feet. And the trouble is, if you tell them that you want the feet, they look at you weird, and then they give you it with all the guts
and everything.
They said, have it. Yeah, so that was fun.
Yeah, so they're very rarely preserved, and even when we've got them, they very rarely displayed on fossils because they're so thin and fragile, or they're just a pain to make if you're making them for a cast. So you see them on some of the big ichthyosaurs. Some of them have, and even the famous Crystal Palace dinosaurs. There's the ichthyosaur in the lake, and it's got actually because people didn't really know what it was when they were making these models. The eye is sculpted as if these things were an external feature of the eye, and there's a ring of plates on the supposedly life model of these. But yeah, owls have almost tubular ones. Owl skeletons are horrifying in that sense. They're like little gun turrets that poke up out of the eye and stick out as little cones.
Wow.
They're horrible.
But why? What are they?
I think they're basically just there to help support the eye, and obviously with something like the big ichthyosaur, so there's a thing called ophthalmosaurus, you can already kind of see where that name is coming from, which are the kind of soup plate eyes. Their orbit is 25, 30 centimetres across, absolutely massive. You think about that as a sphere of gel, which is what an eyeball is, and these animals are diving to very considerable depths, which is why they have giant eyes so they can see in the dark, deep underwater. There's going to be an awful lot of squishing going on and attempted deformation of that. And so having something which helps hold its shape is going to be very important. And similarly, I think that's the reason you have these kind of turreted shapes in owls, because obviously they're doing very complicated things trying to see at night. Again, not a sclerotic ring expert, partly because we basically don't have any. They're so rare. But yeah, I think that they're just some kind of structural support, more or less.
I learned from your show and from reading up about it that alligators and crocodiles are very close cousins to birds if you look back in the family trees.
Yeah, so if you accidentally excise dinosaurs from evolutionary history, crocodiles are one of the closest things to birds, and certainly the closest living things to birds, yeah.
But their eyes have these vertical slits, as you mentioned, don't they?
They do, but
pupils.
they're obviously doing something quite different.
Yeah, so it's got to be something to do with the function of the eye.
Yeah, it's
why they've developed the way they have.
This is the big question for so many things off dinosaurs, is you have these awkward kind of trade-offs or things that don't quite necessarily line up in terms of what their evolutionary history is or their ancestors had versus things that we know can change those things like ecology. So, crocodilians are very close relative of dinosaurs. They're a very good thing to look at if you want to know what dinosaurs were doing. On the other hand, all living crocodilians that we have are kind of weird. They're all semi-aquatic, which dinosaurs aren't. Most of them are, if not crepuscular or nocturnal, certainly quite active at night, which is not going to be true of all dinosaurs. And they did separate from the dinosaur lineage 240 million years ago or so. They've been evolving on their own, doing their own interesting things. And so the question therefore becomes, well, just how accurate is this? A good example is the way that they walk. So crocodiles look like they're sprawled crawlers. They look lizard-like and they tend to hold their legs out to the side. But ancestrally, they didn't. They actually walked with their legs under the body in the way that birds and mammals do. Now, crocodiles can still do this, and it's because they're in this quasi-position where their ancestors were upright. But actually, if you want to swim, you really want to be able to tuck your limbs into the side when you've got a sinusoidal body movement. And so they've actually, not only are their limbs rather shorter than their ancestors were, because they're not coming around land that much, they've also kind of changed their articulation so they can tuck their limbs in. So we know that they've kind of reverted to this more sprawling-like posture. And that's not then, inverted commas, normal or correct situation. And it's a fairly obvious one. And famously, crocodiles can actually cheat and still kind of get into that old upright posture. It's called the high walk. And if you search for this on YouTube, you can see videos of them really getting up off the ground and getting their arms and legs under the body. Usually on Florida golf courses, yeah. But I've seen crocs do it in captivity and in the wild. But we can see that. But with things like the pupils, well, we just don't know. We know that being nocturnal tends to give you a slit-like pupil. We know that being close to the ground or close to the surface can give you a slit-like pupil. And that's kind of what they're doing sitting on the surface. So do they have slit-like pupils because that's what their ancestors had and that's what dinosaurs would therefore have had? Or have they got it because modern crocodiles are faffing about in the water and therefore have evolved a different pupil shape to deal with that? I'd actually rather suspect the latter, but it's this confounding, or this, the evolution and ecology are not necessarily working in harmony to provide a nice, clear, simple answer.
And what a nuisance that eyes are like soft tissue and not going to be found in fossils. And even when we have got our sclerotic rings, they're not going to tell you the shape of the pupil. So, yes, they're very unhelpful in that regard. And this is why, there's so much inference in all of this. But it's also why, particularly in the past where we didn't have such a good understanding, there's this really clear trend of dinosaurs always had a very slitty pupil because it's, that's what crocodiles have, or even that's what snakes have. They're reptiles, they have a snake pupil. Ignoring, of course, the fact immediately that loads of lizards and things don't have that at all and have a circular pupil or even other shapes. But no, we're giving them the crocodile one. I think at least in part because it makes them look a bit sinister. I was going to say, that's certainly what I've learned from Jurassic Park. So, it must be true, mustn't it?
Yeah.
But that's interesting what you say about lizards and things not having that shaped pupil.
Well, or not all of them do. And this is the thing. Yeah. It's that it's very easy for people, and I don't mean that, a lay person, but even scientists, and again in the ye olden days where we didn't necessarily look that closely. If you ask someone, well, what's reptile pupils? Oh yeah, they're often kind of slit shaped. Well, dinosaurs are reptiles. Job done. That's about as far as people looked at it, I think. But obviously, the more you look, the more you know, and
this is it, and this noticing the eyes. It's just this, if I may, has sort of brought up this second question, or this, which was actually the original question, but I've moved on to eyes recently. So I recently took a course in bird identification by Krista from the Birding Tools podcast. She runs a bird ID course, and I decided to take it because although I'm fairly good at bird ID, I thought there's always things you can learn. And I was astonished at how much I did learn from it, because there are aspects of birds that I hadn't considered before or hadn't considered in detail. So while I spend a lot of time sitting looking at birds, observing them, observing their behaviour, I'd never really looked in detail at the feather patterns. And I don't mean the colour, I mean the groupings of feathers. So I knew that birds had primaries and secondaries on their wings, and I knew they had tail feathers, and I knew sort of parts of birds. My understanding was very coarse. It was very much at the high level. And during the bird course, we went into more detail about groupings of feathers, things like the coverts and the scapulars and the groupings around the body, around the head. And it's suddenly I've become absolutely fascinated. I've got a dunnock that's in my garden, which is a small brown garden bird that often skulks in the undergrowth, but it's got gorgeous. It's a sparrow. Soft...
Let's be honest. For the non-expert listener, we're talking about sparrows.
Well, we're not, because even for the non-expert birders, They are very different to sparrows in that if you look at them and see the shape of the beak, it's different. They've got little pointy beaks. Sparrows have got very, and I'm sure you all know this, finch-like beaks. That's right. But dunnocks are more insect-eating, and they have a more pointed beak. And they're very gorgeous birds, and often you ignore them because they're just these little quiet birds that skulk around, but sometimes you do see them, and they've got a gorgeous song. But they've got really lovely soft plumage colouring, which is a sort of blues and greys and some browns. But when you look at them, you realise that actually parts of their head, that they've got like ear coverts and groupings around their head, and then you can see that as the shapes and colours go down, you see the groupings of the feathers. And while I was really looking at colours, I wasn't looking at structure, and it's the structure of feathers. And so I'm now looking at birds in much more detail than I was before, and this is how I got onto the eye thing as well. I heard you say on your episode about birds and dinosaurs that some dinosaurs had feathers.
Yeah, loads of them. I mean, hundreds of species.
Really? I had no idea at all that there might, apart from Archaeopteryx, which looks like it's got, feathers. So other dinosaurs had feathers too. And so is this where feathers started then?
Yeah, so feathers at the bare minimum go deep into dinosaurs. There's we have dealt with this more than once, I won't go into it in detail, but there are questions about quite how far back they go. And I will try as brief as possible to say it is at least possible that feathers extend beyond dinosaurs and are actually evolved before dinosaurs even appeared. There's at least the possibility that feathers go back 220, 240 million years and are very, very ancient structures. But even the oldest feathered dinosaurs that we've got are 165 million years old-ish. So feathers were around for 100 million years before dinosaurs went extinct. These are not some new phenomenon.
Right, and were they always to do with flight?
No, so feathers evolved well before flight was ever a thing, perhaps unsurprisingly, because you get what are called exaptations, so things that have evolved for one purpose which actually turn out to be very useful for something else, and feathers are a classic example of an exaptation, where they almost certainly evolved initially for some kind of combination of insulation, because obviously they're very good at trapping heat, and display, because you can do lots of interesting things with feathers in terms of colours and patterns, and you can shed them, and you can raise them up and down, and things like this that you can't do with scales, for example. And therefore, that's probably a large part of why they evolved originally and then spread across the body and got bigger. We already see some interesting functional things in the fossil record. So there are some with very, very spiky feathers, which has been suggested to be defensive in the same way that you have things like porcupines, that they are rather sharp and quill-like feathers along the base of the neck of a herbivore, which is otherwise more or less defenseless. That's quite a reasonable interpretation and reasonable possibility. It's been
Are those called Artichokosaurus?
No, it's annoyingly a thing called Bapiaosaurus because it's from Beipiao in China. Not the most exciting of names, unfortunately. It's been suggested that, eyelashes might have been very important. You see things like macaws and big hornbills have these basic complete analogues of eyelashes, which for lots of dinosaurs with big eyes was probably a quite important thing. We don't have any direct evidence of them, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they weren't present in a bunch of these animals as well.
T-Rex definitely had them.
Really long ones. You curl them a little bit at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Well, we know that other tyrannosaurs have feathers, and therefore T-Rex probably had a few somewhere. And I'd suggest they've got massive eyes.
Yeah, it's and you don't want.
It can't scratch.
Yeah, and it can't rub them easily. It can't lick them easily like a lot of animals could. And they were huge and important. Yeah, you'd want to protect them. They would have still had the nictating membrane, so they'd have had this secondary semi-transparent eyelid that both modern birds and crocodiles have. So it's entirely expected that dinosaurs have them. But that doesn't mean that some big, again, like hornbills do, some eyelashes are going to be useful as well to keep some of the grit out.
This is changing my mind about what Tyrannosaurus Rex must have looked like, with the possibility of big eyelashes and some feathers and...
Well, me and Emma Kennedy say they were white with blue spots, which I think we proved at one point, rather stupidly. But there were tyrannosaurs that are entirely. We did an episode on tyrannosaurs, and they were entirely covered in feathers.
Yeah, you got
big birds.
Yeah, you got a thing called Eutyrannus, which is 6, 7, 8 meters long, probably weighed about a ton, and was as feathered as any modern bird. With very thin plumes, they'd have been much more like an ostrich or a rhea or a kiwi or baby birds. They didn't have the complicated shape that modern flight feathers do, but they were completely coated in feathers.
This is fascinating.
We've talked about before velociraptors having the quill knobs on their ulna, the forearm.
Yeah.
So, they're not flight feather, but in my head, they're flight feather-like structures. When you see people drawing velociraptors' feathers, they are very bird-like and wing-like.
Yeah, so at that point, we think they've got, something that's very much like a modern flight feather. They're just not flying with it. So, again, like ostriches have something rather like that. So it's got the rachis, it's got the shaft up the middle, and it's got these kind of two flattened planes, one flattened plane, but, bit either side of it, basically, that's made up of this, rather Velcro-like material of, called, hooks and barbules, so they grip onto each other and hold it together into that plane, which is why you can get a ruffled feather and kind of zip it back together. They've got something very like that. But that point about the quill knobs actually goes back to the original thing Suzy was saying about patterns of feathers. If you pluck a bird, if you look at your whole chicken or similar thing that has been plucked and ready for the oven, you can see basically all the little dots in the skin where the feathers were originally stuck. But the interesting thing is, if you do this between multiple different birds, you'll see there's an extremely close alignment between many of those points and their exact position and location. And they actually appear developmentally in what are called feather tracts. So as in like a tract of land or as in a pathway. And so clusters of feathers that are similar tend to be next to each other in tracts. And I don't know, but I'd be amazed if this wasn't part of the reason that you tend to get certain clusters of feathers, not just being a certain type, but obviously being a certain colour or pattern, because developmentally those are being produced as one basically little block on the body. And therefore, yes, your primaries at the wingtip or your secondaries inside that, or the coverts that sit on top at the front of the wing, for people who don't know, they're going to be one block of colour. They're already one type of feather that are slightly distinct from the other neighbouring ones, but we can absolutely link them to feather tracts. And there's this fantastic book. It was produced, I've actually got a copy of it somewhere that I was able to get hold of in China. And it was produced by something like the US military veterinary services or something, one of those obscure branches. And it was done in the 40s or 50s when people were interested in that kind of stuff. And of course, once it's done, no one ever bothers redoing it again. But there's maps of different birds and all their different feather tracts. Though, of course, mostly chickens and ducks, which annoyingly in the evolutionary sense are actually very close relatives to each other and therefore exclude almost all the rest of bird diversity. But you can see just how closely these feather tracts line up. And it is reasonable to infer that a lot of these probably transfer into dinosaurs because they're so similar. And this is at least part of the, let's say, issue around some of the earliest feathered dinosaurs. So there's a thing called... now its name's completely dropped out of my head. It was one of those, I was about to say it, and as I was about to say it, it went. It's a big thing from Spain with a hump on its back. An allosaur size thing, and it's just completely dropped out of my head. How can I not remember this?
Just carry on, and it'll come to you. Hello, future Iszi here. I believe he means the concavinator corcovatus, which means meat eater from Quenta with a hump. And it's got a literal hump, it's not just angry. Anyway, it's fun when he forgets, isn't it? It's almost like he's a human.
Anyway, so there's this big thing, which is, if it had feathers, would have been kind of the earliest branch of dinosaur or theropod evolution to have had feathers. And it's got these like bumps on its arm, and people have said these are putative quill knobs, except they're not kind of in a line. They're kind of dotted about, and that's not how you get feather tracts, and that's not how you get quill knobs, because there's a reason that they're in a line, because that is that classic developmental pathway. And so it'd be really quite odd if it hadn't. And similarly, there's an ornithomimosaur from Canada that was described a few years ago as having the bases of feathers preserved. So if you look at its forelimb, it's got these little black V's that are like stains on the bone, and they've been interpreted as the base of feathers. That they don't have a quill knob, so there's no corresponding bump on the bone, but this appears to be like the staining of the base of the feather when the thing basically decayed. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, but the original paper argued that, again, these are evidence of a feather tract, and that these were big primary-like feathers, flight-like feathers, even if they're not flying with them. But they're not in a straight line. They're kind of dotted about semi-randomly, and it's like that's not a feather tract. That's not how these things look. And so it's really kind of hard to say, and obviously what you'd want is a much better specimen that has them preserved properly. The stupid fossil record doesn't preserve everything well.
So this is amazing then. So it's totally open to the idea that if dinosaurs had feathers, or certain dinosaurs had feathers, that they could also have had quite different colours.
Oh yeah, I'd be amazed if they don't. And we already have dinosaurs back in the early Cretaceous, so 100 million years ago, with juveniles and adults of the same species have different feather types on them, just like you see now. Baby chicks look really quite different to chickens, not just in their colour, but the actual feather types that they have. We can see the same thing. We can see fluffy baby dinosaurs and then more normally feathered adult dinosaurs. If they're doing that, there's absolutely no reason to think that they're not shedding their feathers in some kind of fairly systematic way, just like modern birds do, and that males had a breeding plumage for a few months of the year, or that they all went white in winter when it was snowy, or who knows what.
Just stunning, isn't that amazing? I'm just thinking back, obviously you work in the field, and so all the latest things, but for someone who learned about dinosaurs when she was a kid and has seen dinosaur films and has a passing knowledge of dinosaurs, I had no idea that in my lifetime, because I'm a little bit older than you two, but that in my lifetime, the knowledge has moved on so much further than I thought. And I like the idea of dinosaurs. And I kind of, if I see an article about dinosaurs, I will read it. But I've clearly been very remiss at keeping up to date in just general knowledge about it.
This is why we started the podcast.
I know.
This is why, and why we need to get you on to talk about modern dinosaurs.
But isn't this amazing what you can learn from podcasts? I'm constantly telling people how fantastic podcasts are, and this is just brilliant.
A massive thank you to Suzy Buttress there. Please do check out her dinosaur podcast, because it is very good. Even though she only looks at modern alive dinosaurs, which
not those really good old dead ones.
Exactly. Although I'm looking around, and you've got a dinosaur, an alive dinosaur, an extant dinosaur on your wall, which we actually saw at Thiel Park.
Yeah, Bucorvus, my southern ground hornbill, one of my favourite birds.
Yeah, with his big eyes, big lashes, kind of like patient, a bit sleepy, and wouldn't want to come across one if you were a small
lizard.
thing.
Yeah, you'd be
swallowed.
Yeah.
Swallowed quite quickly. But other than that, you've got quite mammalian in this room.
Yeah.
Mammalian and
crocodile skull.
Crocodile skull, that's true. But it's right next to a lynx skull, so yeah.
And there's a snake painting on the wall.
That is a snake painting, but they're a different branch of reptile.
Yes, they are.
Like thingy
yes,
thought birds.
But they're also not mammalian.
They are not mammalian, this is true. But they're not dinosaurs. And there's an elephant over there. And something under a tea bag. So, it's my tea bag. I've made it all dirty. Cool. I hope that double downs and clears up all of the bird issues for everybody. And particularly so I can just tell them to listen to this episode of all the episodes when I get told that I'm a lying liar who lied. I'm not. Birds, a little wren, is the same type of thing as a T-Rex.
Yeah, ultimately.
And a triceratops.
Yep.
And an iguanodon. Mm-hmm. No, you're making it up, Dave. It's not.
Yeah, I know, and it is weird. I mean, but that's the thing. When you put all that stuff together, you've got that history, and yeah, even today you can line up Archaeopteryx and Compsognathus even. But particularly when you've got other early birds like Confuciusornis and Sapiornis, and you've got things like Microraptor and Velociraptor and Oviraptorosaurs. Oh boy, it's obvious just how easy it is to step from feature to feature to feature.
If it's hard to get your brain around, imagine a tiny little like field mouse or a dormouse, those really tiny, cute little things. And then imagine the blue whale. Those are both mammals.
Yeah. I thought you were going to go with capybara. I mean, it's quite a long way from a field mouse up to one of them, let alone.
But ultimately, if you're looking at mammals, both of those are mammals.
Yeah.
And therefore, it makes sense.
It's a fair point that, you would look at Diplodocus and a hummingbird and go, well, God, how can they possibly be the same? But yeah, bats and whales are in the same group. And I would argue they're considerably more different.
I saw a very good TikTok, which was pointing out that if you're going to have lampreys, if you're going to count those as fish, then basically everything has to be fish.
Yes.
Because they're so back far in the evolutionary past that, we've got more in common with a sea bass than the sea bass does with a lamprey.
Yeah, that's when you start getting into the paraphily arguments and the problems of common names for things versus what we now know to be evolutionary clades. Yes, there's an argument that basically every vertebrate is a fish.
Yes.
Including us.
Which really puts that QI podcast down to, because we had Dan Schreiber on, and no such thing as a fish, no, everything is a fish.
Yeah.
Which
it's the opposite of that. Yeah.
We should rename this one, Everything is a Fish. But yeah, so cool. So if you have a difficulty with that, just remember hummingbird, Diplodocus is to dormouse, blue whale.
Yeah.
Same sort of.
As I say,
math.
less even. So yeah, it suddenly doesn't sound as ridiculous.
It doesn't, but it still sounds pretty ridiculous. To be fair, I wouldn't want a blue whale on my feeder. No, hang on. Anyway, until next time.
Rawr.
This episode of Terrible Lizards was made possible by our generous patrons on Patreon. To support the show and for bonus content, please go to patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. For links to everything, including merch and past episodes, go to terriblelizards.co.uk. Please follow us both on Twitter. I'm at ISZI_LAWRENCE and Dave is at DAVE_HONE. Send us your questions either via Patreon or terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. If you can't afford to support us on Patreon, please do write a review and recommend the show to your friends. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot to us.